Morning, Eden. We are on Memtesima Bays 49b, the last paragraphs of Tractate Sotah. A big milestone. It was 400 plus classes.
Yeah.
So 2 years later, Baruch Hashem. Okay, just
in several different rooms.
In several different rooms, with masks, without masks.
Right.
All right, thank you. So just a comment from yesterday. Rabbi emailed me and I responded to him, but I wanted to share with everybody here. He noted that there are Rashi's, a comment elsewhere, that Chochma Sivonis, the designation of Greek philosophy, which we discussed yesterday, as distinct from Lashon Yavanis, the language of Greek. There are some commentaries. Rashi points this out, not here, but Rashi elsewhere, that Chochma Sivonis doesn't necessarily mean Greek philosophy, but rather a language that was known to the aristocracy alone, like a certain dialect of Greek that was known to the aristocracy. So I want to clarify yesterday, I forgot to, which is that my understanding of language versus dialect, and I was explaining yesterday how there is one thing, which is language, like technically speaking, which language you speak, whether you speak English, Greek, or Hebrew, but then there's language in terms of the manner in which you communicate and the cultural context. So to me, when Rashi comments and says Chochma Sivonis is a unique language for the aristocracy, I think that ties into their cultural understanding of philosophy. As the masses of Greeks did not learn Greek philosophy, it was the aristocracy that did. And that's what caused the divide, even in language, between the aristocracy and the masses. So this Jew who was educated enough to have philosophical background so that his language matched the aristocracy, he was able to communicate to them not to send the animal sacrifices over. So my comment is not distinct from Rashi's comment, but stacked on it. Another thing is, this explains why the Gemoro refers to it as Chochmas Yavanis. In English, the word Greek could either be the language Greek or could be the people Greek. But in Hebrew, the people Greek would be Yavan, and the language Greek would be Yavanit. Okay? So here it says Chochmat Yavanit, which means the wisdom of Greek language, not the wisdom of Yavan, not Greek philosophy, which would be Chochmat Yavan, but Chochmat Yavan, or maybe Chochma Yavanis, which would be like Greek philosophy, or Chochmat Yavan, the philosophy of the Greeks. But here it's Chochmat Yavanit, like the philosophy or the wisdom of the language of Greek, which is partially why I give that interpretation, that it means here a certain cultural and philosophical understanding that changes the way in which you communicate. Okay, just wanted to clarify that. Okay, so we are to the bottom of the page. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 lines from the bottom of the page. The first word is Lamalchus, and the second word is Bepulmus. The Mishnah said, Bepulmus Achrein, during the last struggle, during the last war with Titus, that finally led to the destruction. Gazru, the sages forbade or made a decree against Shalai Kalaba Paryoin, that a woman, that the kala should not be carried around, and we called it there's a word for it, this like little man-held chariot, like a box with like poles that come out of the box, and 4 people carry it. It's called something. There was a word for it we had. Anyway, they used to carry the brides out of their home to the chuppah in that. And that's a kind of extra level of unnecessary joy and jubilation and celebration. And they, as part of their effort to subdue celebration, considering the destruction, they banned that practice of carrying the bride in that thing. And the Gemara comments that later, our sages, the sages of the Mishnah, which is within a century after the destruction, they said, no, let's bring the custom back. So the Gemara asks, my time, what's the reason they brought it back? Why would they override an enactment of a previous generation? Answers the Gemara, Mishum Tzniusa, because this carrying the bride in such a fashion, besides for the celebratory element of it, it also has an element of modesty. And I guess women being walked down the street in public in their gowns, in the dirty street, and people all over the place, and people gawking, they figured, okay, maybe it subdues the celebration, but better put it back into that thing so that you can.
It also had a canopy. So
Yes, correct.
Seen by people who are on a higher level.
Some of them had full canopies, yeah.
Exactly.
Some of them were open and some of them were full canopy.
Exactly.
And it seems like this was full canopy. So for the sake of modesty, they reintroduced that practice.
Looks like something they must have carried the iron.
Something similar. They still have it today in the if you go touring in the Far East. Yeah, the henna, they have that kind of thing.
Yeah.
The henna kind of is a play on this earlier tradition. And in the Far East, they still have these things where it's like the wealthier people walk around the streets being carried in these. There's a word for it, I forgot what it's called. Anyway. The ancient Egyptians, when you travel through the desert, if you had a camel, if you walked, because you were very poor, if you had a camel, it's because you were maybe middle class. If you're really upper class, you had people lined up carrying this like miniature room. It's like with your bed and everything, you just be carried, It's like the real aristocracy.
You really can't walk in this.
Unless you're born and raised there and your feet are conditioned, right? There's a famous Gemoro where the guy who challenges Hillel's nerves, one of the things he asks him is how they had flat feet and able to walk in the desert. Anyway, okay. Final commentary, says the Gemara, Mishim Beis Rabbi Yochanan and Zakkai, Rabbi Yochanan. The Mishnah commented on a number of sages that when they died, certain qualities died with them. And that no longer do people have that same level of virtue. And the Mishnah went through a number of virtues exemplified by various different sages that ceased once they passed. On the list is Rabbi Yochanan, Mishim Beis Rabbi Yochanan, once Rabbi Yochanan. Once Rabbi Yochanan passed, Batla Chachma, wisdom is no longer. The level of wisdom that he achieved. Tan Rabbanan, our sages taught. Right, this is the Gemara now introducing a Mishnaic text that's somewhat more elaborate than the Mishnah, as is often the case. And that text reads, Mishim Beis Rabbi Eliezer, when Rabbi Eliezer passed away, Nignuzuz Sefer Torah. They buried a Torah scroll. Rashi explains, this does not mean they buried a Torah scroll with him, but that he was a walking Torah scroll. As he himself had contained so much knowledge, so much, Rashi puts it, so much halacha, so much Jewish law, and it was also clear in his mind and organized in his mind that it was like opening a books with a codex. So when they buried him, it was like burying a Sefer Torah. This Mishnaic text continued. When Rabbi Yeshua passed away, Batla Eitzo Machshava, counsel and thoughtfulness passed with him. Counsel and thoughtfulness. Rashi explains, he was very good at, he was very witty, had a good, clear sense of the law. He was very clear in his erudition and very witty, and knew how to respond when challenged by those who were heretics or whatnot. He had a very clear mind and knew how to respond very well. So counsel and thought, or thoughtfulness, ceased with Rabbi Yeshua. Mar continues. Mishemes Rabbi Eliezer, Rabbi Akiva. When Rabbi Akiva passed away, Batlu Zroye Torah. Those who were, Zroye means like their arm, those who were very strong in Torah. Rashi explains that this is a depth of study that Rabbi Akiva excelled in knowing how to derive strong, solidified law, even from, the extra letters and change in language in the Torah, knowing how to use the oral tradition to really get deep and solid law. That's how Rashi explains or translates this word, Zroye Torah, the arms of Torah. And that passed with Rabbi Akiva. And likewise, the Nistimu Mayanai Sachachma, and the wells of wisdom have been closed. There's no commentary on this from Rashi. But perhaps this is a reference to the fact that Rabbi Akiva had a massive academy, right? It was his students that died during this period that were now mourning between Pesach and Shavuos from the massive academy. And then after that happened, he restarted again. So he was known for knowing how to build a system of strong education, the wells of wisdom. So perhaps that's what it means. It's closed ever since he passed away. It no longer has that. It should also note, this is something I'm noting this because it's in my mind. It's fresh in my mind, considering that we started studying the Rambam in the daily study cycle. And the first item on the cycle is the introduction of Maimonides. And in the introduction, which I recommend you all read, if you haven't yet, in that introduction, he describes the tradition and passed down from Moshe Rabbeinu all the way till his day. He's explaining where he fits into the context of the tradition and how he's the collector of all tradition till his day and organizing it in a clear, concise fashion. That's essentially the gist of his introduction. Now, when it goes down the line of the succession of tradition, he first goes down and then goes up. So he starts from Sinai and says, Moshe learned from Sinai. And Moshe taught with the elders and with Pinchas and Eliezer, and then he transferred it to Yeshua. He has the responsibility of carrying the tradition. And then Yeshua passed it to the next, all the way down, till it gets to the end of the Gemara's era, Ravina and Ravashi. And then he says, in conclusion, there are 40 generations from the end of the Gemara till Sinai, and goes up, and then counts up. 1, Ravina and Ravashi. 2, above. 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. 40, 39. Moshe Rabbeinu 40, God at Sinai. Does it that way. Now, if you look carefully at the list going down versus the list going up, they're a little bit different. The list going up goes 41 to 1 to 1 to 1 to 1. The list going down, at one point, the line splits, and he only picked back up on one of these two lines that split. And it splits by the generation of Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai, and his counterpart is Rabbi Gamliel II, I want to say. So the Zugais are before that. Hillel Shammai, Shmai Avtalia, Shmai Avtalia before Hillel and Shammai. But at the destruction of the Second Temple, there's a split in the line. And he goes down Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai's line, which takes us to the more dominant scholars that we see in the Mishnah, Rabbi Kiva, Rabbi Tarfon, the names, Rabbi Shimon, the names that really come up, Rabbi Shimon meaning Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai, not Rabbi Shimon ben Gamliel, that come up in the Mishnah. And then, Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai being the progenitor of all these. And then, at the end of that line, he goes back to the other line of Shimon ben Gamliel, whose son was Gamliel, whose son was Shimon, whose son was Yehuda, who wrote the Mishnah. So when he goes back up 40, that whole line of Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai, including Rabbi Kiva, is not in the list, because they're not in the straight line. But on the way down, they are there, which is somewhat puzzling to me, and I'm not really sure what to make of it. Because if you go the line up, it's almost like Rabbi Kiva, and that whole school doesn't even matter. But when he comes down, he has a whole side line that goes 3-4 generations, which is the dominant names that you see in the Mishnah. So my thinking of this is that it's not directly related to the Gemara, but it's interesting nonetheless. My thinking is as follows. If you look at language, Rabbi Soloveitchik in a famous class online, it's available online, he points this out. And when Moshe Rabbeinu teaches his first generation, he describes 3 different types of teaching. He says he learned with the 70 elders. He says certain people received it from him, and then he says, but then Sotah, he gave the tradition to Yeshua, which means there's learning, and then there's the transference of the Sotah, the tradition. What's the difference? Presumably, it would seem to mean like this. Rabbi Soloveitchik offers one explanation, which I don't think it fits very perfectly well in the language of the Rambam. It would seem to me that this is the correct interpretation. That the word Sotah, used in the Mishnah, for example, Moshe Kibul Torah Sinai, Moshe received the Torah from Sinai, and Masarah to Yeshua, and he transferred it, Masarah, that word tradition, transferred to Yeshua, Yeshua is Elokeinu, Yeshua to the elders, and so on and so forth. That specifically is not referring to the teaching of Torah. Everybody learns Torah. It's specifically referring to the responsibility to collate and codify all of Torah into one central body that would then pass it to the next generation. So you could have had thousands of people learning in thousands of studies halls. But there's only one office, which would be the office of the Sanhedrin, that was responsible for collecting all that information, codifying it, coming to clear, concise conclusions, and passing it to the next generation. That's the Sotah specifically. Right? So now, in this generation here, at the destruction of the temple, there is the line of the Sanhedrin, which was responsible for collecting all the information and passing it down from generation to generation. And that's the line of the 40, which is Rabbi Shimon, Rabbi Gamliel, Rabbi Shimon, Rabbi Gamliel, Hillel, back up to Moshe Rabbeinu.
Gamliel wasn't he dethroned?
for a brief period. Yeah,
Would that have anything to do with it? There was be a split
maybe,
between
maybe.
Yochanan and
maybe.
Zakkai, but
It wasn't Yochanan Zakkai then. It was later, Yeshua and Elazar ben Azariah, which is a bit later than Yochanan ben Zakkai. But it is that line, so it's certainly related. And perhaps what I'm about to say will stack well with that, which is that during this period, even though there was the central office of the Sanhedrin, the real bulk of learning didn't happen around that office. It happened around the study halls of Yavna and of Yochanan ben Zakkai.
right. So he allowed in
Because he allowed the study. That's right. He was the one that negotiated to keep learning going. And that became eventually the schools of Rekiva. So even though all that information ended up being collected back into the offices of the Sanhedrin, and that was passed down to the next generation, and therefore written in the Mishnah by Rabbi Huda HaNasi, who was on that line, but the information he got wasn't directly on that line. It took a detour for a while. So even though the information was collected by other people, the responsibility of transferring the Masada remained in that line. Right? And perhaps that's connected to this idea of Rabbi Kiva, Nistim Mayanas Chachma, that explosion of knowledge under Rabbi Kiva's leadership as building these academies pretty much ended. Because the Bar Kokhba revolt put an end to that, which is Rabbi Kiva's time. Rabbi Kiva was killed by the Romans, and that was pretty much the end of the big schools of Israel. There were some smaller schools that didn't do super well, which I shouldn't say they just didn't do super well. They did amazing because they wrote the Talmud, they wrote the Jerusalem Talmud. But compared to the Babylonian Talmud, they didn't do as well. So the centers of Torah study in this massive fashion in Israel ended with Rabbi Kiva. Even though the responsibility of collating and codifying all information and passing it to the next generation did keep on going, not in Rabbi Kiva's line, but in the line of Rabbi Yehuda, which went back to Rabbi Gamliel, to Rabbi Shimon, Rabbi Gamliel, to Hillel, and he collected from these people on the other line of Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai and Rabbi Kiva, and retired from Rabbi Yehuda, and Rabbi Shimon ben Yochai, and so on. So this is a little tangent related to our Rambam learning, related to some history we've been discussing, and related to this line that the Gemoro says that when Rabbi Kiva passed, the wells of wisdom were closed. Okay, let's conclude a few more lines. Nisha Mishra Belabazib ben Azariah. When Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah passed, that's the person you're referring to,
Right.
The one who replaced the Gamliel, which I'm sure, by the way, it's related to the subject that we're talking about, because maybe they didn't have the same trust in that office to hold it down, so they kind of took a detour for a little bit. Maybe, I don't know. Anyway, so when Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah passed away, Batlu, there is no longer a Torah Chachma. The crown of wisdom, namely, this is a pasuk in Mishlei, Ateres Chachamim Ashram, the crown of the wise are their wealth. And Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah himself was both very wealthy and a great scholar. So he had the crown of wisdom, right? Both wisdom and both Torah knowledge and wealth in one office, in one seat. So when he passed, there's no longer that kind of level. When Rabbi Chanina ben Dosa passed away, Rabbi Chanina ben Dosa, famous for performing miracles and having this kind of power over nature, men of action ceased. We mentioned this in the Mishnah. Men of action meaning those who know how to control Maisa, knowing how to control the reality of our world. We use the example of when his daughter wanted to light Shabbos candles, had no oil, she only had vinegar. And Rabbi Chanina ben Dosa said, let the one who said oil should burn, let him say that vinegar shall burn. Right? God creates the world through speech, and the speech that God projects into creation will give each creation its nature. So says Rabbi Chanina ben Dosa, let's manipulate the formula, and now vinegar can burn. Right? This is Anshe Maisa, this is men of actions, and how to control reality.
Did it with the bread or neighbor or something?
All the bread with the neighbor, yeah. It's a similar list of stories with Rabbi Chanina ben Dosa. The Gemara continues. Mishemes Abba Yosi ben Katunta, when Abba Yosi, son of Katunta, passed, Batlu Chesidim ben Katunta. I mentioned this before, that sometimes the word ben means son of, and sometimes ben is like a title. So when you want to say that someone is I don't think it works in Hebrew, modern Hebrew, but in certainly in Aramaic, you would say, let's say, a bar seichel. Bar, like the word bar mitzvah, means son of, and seichel means intelligent. So bar seichel means son of intelligence. It doesn't mean his father is intelligent. It means he's a man who's mastered intelligence.
Could say also like Ben Torah or
or
something.
like a Ben Torah.
Yeah.
Exactly, a Ben Torah means a son of Torah, means he's someone who mastered Torah. So oftentimes the word Ben, and then the word that comes afterwards, not the name of the father, but the name of
Like
a description, like an accolade. So here it's Abu Yosi Ben Katunta. Katunta means a small one. And therefore the Gemara comments, when he passed, Batlu Chasidim, there's no longer the real pious ones, those who go beyond the letter of the law, those who are scrupulous and meticulous in their behavior. And the Gemara comments, Ben Katunta. Why is he called Abu Yosi, son of Katunta? Katunta meaning the small one. Because he was the least of all these Chasidim. Of these pious, scrupulous ones, he was the least of them. And when he passed, that was the end. Gemara continues, Mishemes Ben Azai, when Ben Azai passed away, Batlu Hashakdonin, those who are truly invested in diligent Torah study are no longer. Right? Ben Azai, we mentioned him in the Mishnah as well. He's the one who said, Nafshi Chashka B'Torah, my soul desires Torah, and therefore he didn't want to marry. Or at least according to one version, he married Rabbi Akiva's daughter. And he's the one who, he's one of the people who entered with Rabbi Akiva into this mystical experience. Right? Arba Nichnas Pardes, the Gemara describes, 4 entered into the garden. They explored some mystical experience. And Rabbi Akiva warns them against not saying certain things when they see certain visions. The Gemara describes, one came out and lost his mind. One came out, left Judaism. One stayed in there. And one came out in peace. The only one to come out in peace was Rabbi Akiva. The others had a negative reaction. One left Judaism, one lost his mind, had a nervous breakdown of some sort, and the other stayed in there. And Nazai is the one who stayed in there because he was the one whose whole life was complete, like what's the word? Like abstinence and asceticism, just completely devoted and absorbed in Torah study. And indeed, I think I mentioned this. We learned the Mishnah. It's the halacha. The halacha is that a person must marry. That's Jewish law. A person should seek out marriage, unless the person is on the level of Ben Azai, whose love for women can be replaced by love for Torah. For the rest of us humans who have human biological urges, get married. So Moshe Rabbeinu, Rambam speaks about that, his level of prophecy and why it was like that. Okay. Mishemes Ben Zoma, when Ben Zoma passed, Batlu Hadarshanin, there are no longer those who know how to give good speeches. I should also note, just interestingly, there are 2 people here, Ben Azai and Ben Zoma. And there are others who are referred to as by Ben, without their first name. We also have Ben Azai, Ben Zoma, and Hey, and Bagbag. Yeah. So there's different reasons as to why their names are not mentioned. And one of them is, in the case of Ben Azai, I think Ben Zoma as well, because they died so young, they never had a chance to get smicha, to get ordained. And because they weren't ordained, they don't have the title of Rabbi. Now, if we said their first name, we'd have to omit the title Rabbi. And that would be disrespectful of them, considering their vast Torah knowledge. To not put the word Rabbi there would be disrespectful. To put Rabbi in, we can't because they didn't get the smicha, they didn't get ordained. So therefore, they removed the first name completely. If I remember correctly from the commentary of the Bartanura, he says their name was Shimon. If I remember correctly. Anyway, the Gemara continues. Mishemes. Rabbi Shimon ben Gamliel, when Rabbi Shimon ben Gamliel passed away, Allah goivai the Rabu tzaros, bullies became dominant, and lots of strife begins. Right, this is the era of destruction of the temple.
Go again.
Sorry,
Here we go again.
where things get worse. Yeah, so for that, Mishemes Rebbe. Once Rabbi passed away, Rabbi being the compiler of the Mishnah, the stress doubled. Stress doubled. Okay. Final comment. The Mishnah said, Mishemes Rabbi Batla Nova. The Mishnah said that when Rabbi passed away, Rabbi the compiler of the Mishnah, Batla Nova, there's no longer humility, the yiras chet and fear of sin. With Rabbi passed away, 2 qualities, humility and fear of sin. Rav Yosef Latana, Rav Yosef said to the author of the Mishnah, Rav Yosef lived many years after the author of the Mishnah, but he's kind of speaking to the author of the Mishnah and says, like tisni anava, don't include humility on the list of things that are no longer ever since Rabbi Yehuda passed away. Why not? No, because I'm here and I am humble.
What?
I was waiting for that reaction. The Rebbe's talk, which we'll get to tomorrow, God willing, will address that question amongst many others. What does this mean? I'm humble. What kind of humility is this? We'll discuss that. So when it comes to the Rebbe, it's not Rebbe speaking and saying that I'm humble. It's the compiler of the Mishnah saying that Rebbe, when Rebbe passed away, there's no more humility. But here it's Rabbi Yosef himself saying, I am humble. What does this mean? And Rav Nachman says to the Tana, to the one who authors the Mishnah, like just now, don't include fear of sin as that which is missing ever since Rabbi Yehuda passed away. Because I'm here and I fear sin. So we're not going to Thursday I have bar mitzvah, so I won't be able to be at the class. So we'll have Wednesday and Friday, and Monday we're going to pick up our new learning. So Wednesday and Friday to go through the Rebbe's talk. So we're not going to be able to do all of it. So we're going to go straight to the Rebbe's answers. The Rebbe has a bunch of questions, then the Rebbe has on this bunch of questions, and the Rebbe has a suggested explanation. The Rebbe rejects the suggested explanation, and then goes to his final explanation. So we're going to go straight to his final explanation. So let's lay down some of the questions that the Rebbe has here. Firstly, like you said, what does this mean? Humility. The person says, I'm humble. What kind of statement of humility is this? Right? Never gets to what's the nature of humility at all. What is humility? And furthermore, the Rebbe asks, Rav Yosef and Rav Nachman live at the same time. Rav Yosef says, don't include humility as things that are missing because I'm here. And Rav Nachman says, don't include fear of sin as something that's no longer because I'm here. Instead of each of them speaking about themselves, why didn't they each speak of the other person? Rav Yosef could have said, don't include humility as things that are missing because my friend Rav Nachman is here. So they were around. Rav Nachman could have said, don't include humility on the list of things that are missing because my friend Rav Yosef is here and he's humble. And then Rav Yosef could have said, don't include on the list fear of sin because my friend Rav Nachman's here and he's fear of sin, which seems to imply that they actually disagree with each other. It seems to imply that Rav Yosef is of the view, Rav Nachman, no, he doesn't really fear sin, but I am humble. And Rav Nachman seems to be saying, Rav Yosef, he's not so humble, but I have fear of sin, which further entrenches our question, what's going on here? What kind of statements are these?
Seems like an odd,
Sorry?
not odd, but and is it unusual for the tractate to end on such a thought?
It's a little bit unusual because usually,
Question.
that's right, usually the
questions to the answer.
well, actually, we have, Baruch Hashem, many comments, many dissertations from there about the end of tractates. They would often celebrate a yard site, something of that nature, by concluding a tractate and then publicly sharing an explanation of the last few lines of the tractate. So they would often do that. Take the last paragraph, lay on a bunch of questions, and then give a whole interpretation. But what is unusual here is that ordinarily the tractate ends on a positive note.
Right, that too.
And here it's just kind of like it's anticlimactic.
Well, you could see it maybe. I think maybe it's that there's still hope.
Right. So there's an
and
encouragement.
That lies on you. Not
there's
on
an encouragement
point your
here.
finger to someone and be like,
Don't say, the Mishnah says it's done, so therefore it's done. No, you can work
like
on
that.
it.
You say, he's humble, so we're okay. No, I'm humble.
You have to work on it. Yeah. So there's going to be that element as we learned Rebbe's talk. Yeah, very good. And there's other things, which is, here's another point. Rav Yosef says, don't include humility on the list because I'm humble. Which would mean, in his view, there is no longer any more true fear of sin. And likewise in the reverse. When Rav Nachman says, don't include on the list fear of sin because I'm here, he means to say that there is no longer humility.
I mean, it's inferred from the statement.
It's inferred from the statements and the fact that they each choose to pick half, not the other half. And they each talk about themselves, not the other one, implying that they're disputing as to what still exists today. The Mishnah said, and here's the other thing, the Mishnah seems to link humility and fear of sin. One person, Rabbi, he passed, and when he passed, both humility and fear of sin are gone. Whereas the Gemoro of Nachman and Rav Yosef separate them. Rav Yosef says, well, fear of sin may be gone ever since Rabbi passed away, but humility is not gone because I'm here. And Rav Nachman saying the reverse. Well, maybe humility is gone, but fear of sin is not gone, separating the two from each other. Not as one item, but separating them. So we have to understand exactly what's going on here. And at the core of this is going to become the question, what is truly humility? What does humility mean at the core? And that, God willing, we'll explore tomorrow and on Friday, and then Monday we'll pick up Tractate Pesachim. And with this we say, Hadron Allah Egla Rufa, we will return to you chapter Egla Rufa, the Slikala Masechta Sotah, and we now conclude Masechta Sotah. And I wish a mazel tov to all those who've been following with us ever since the beginning. And I guess now not just wishing a mazel tov, but also to say thank you to all those who stick around with our classes and our learning and interacting. So it's much appreciated, and God willing, to many more years of learning together.
Amen.
Have a wonderful day, Eden.
2 years?
It's about 2 years, yeah. I think we started 2 years ago after Pesach, if I'm not mistaken.
And it took us 2 years to learn Tanya too.
Yeah.
Oh,
So someone asked me how to qualify, like what the level of the classes is. It's hard to say. It's beginners, advanced. I like to qualify it as in-depth for beginners, meaning it's beginners in the sense that we're not opening up 1,000 commentaries, but we're also not just doing a surface reading. We're trying to go a little deeper than just the surface reading, but it doesn't require any major yeshiva backgrounds to follow along with the class. I guess you can call it intermediate, but intermediate sounds like you need to have some background. You don't really necessarily. Although, of course, I'm hoping that as we learn here together, our ability to pick up what the Gemara is saying gets better and easier. So that's certainly something that.
I have a question.
Yeah.
Really quickly, just something that I don't. Okay, so it says, let's say someone passed, and then batla chokhmah, and in one of them earlier when we read, it said someone died, batla humility.
Yeah.
Let's like for batla chokhmah, for example, wasn't King David? They said the wisest one.
Shlomo Melech, but this is
Shlomo Melech.
Shlomo Melech's way earlier.
Right. So wouldn't batla chokhmah when Shlomo Melech passed? Because there's still people after this who had chokhmah.
That's a good point.
So where do you set that? Or for humility, wouldn't it stop at Moshe Rabbeinu and the rest we just try to be like him? Like, wouldn't it? Or they
That's
were
a very
at
good
that
question.
level? Were they at
It's
that
a very good
level?
question. In other words, like this:
That's
if
the
it's a
question.
relative statement, meaning relative to my wisdom is no longer, well, then you could say the same thing of King Solomon. When King Solomon died, there's no more wisdom.
Right.
Hmm.
But here it doesn't seem.
That's a good
like
question.
Irrelevant. It seems like it's like this is where it
There has to
stops.
be a certain context that helps us understand what they mean. It's a good question.
I'm just because I'm like,
Yeah, no, good question. Especially on the humility front, because the Gemara,
Yeah.
the pasuk explicitly states, "Vayish Moshe anu b'kol asher al pnei Adama."
Yeah.
Moshe was the most humble of men amongst all
right,
men of the
you
earth.
would think-
So does this mean Yehuda saying my humility surpassed them, or does he mean in a different level? So maybe we'll get to that in Rebbe's talk. Maybe that might be addressed. We'll have to keep that in mind. But that's a very good question. Meaning, because there are people before them that certainly had these qualities,
right.
and if they had
people
them,
after them will also have.
so the people. Let's just assume that the people before them had humility on a higher level, and the people after them had it at a lower level. And they're saying that our level of humility ended with us. Well, the level of humility of Moshe Rabbeinu ended with Moshe Rabbeinu, and the level of humility after ended with him. So what's the relevance of the statement if it's all relative to
What's the
where
point
they
of
are?
even saying it?
What's the point of even saying if it's all relative? Exactly.
Right.
So good question. So maybe in the Rebbe's talk that'll come clear, but it's a very good question. Okay, wonderful day, Eden, and God willing, tomorrow again. So Wednesday and Friday, Thursday, we won't have a class. I have a bar mitzvah here. Okay, wonderful day, Eden.
Didn't King Solomon go off track a little bit too?
In what way?
Yeah.
His wives.
Yeah.
His wives. I don't know if you can put that on him, but it's
Yeah, I heard something.
okay.
about
We'll leave that aside. It's a controversial topic. Exactly to what degree Shlomo Melech holds count responsibility.
Right? After
Sorry,
kings had to have a limit of how many wives they could.
the Torah says.
Torah.
The Torah itself says not to have too many women, not to have too much money, not to have too many horses. And Shlomo Melech seemed to have
Overabundance of all.
a little too much of all those. So it's a little controversial as to exactly what degree of culpability Shlomo Melech holds for his wives' misbehaviors. But for another time.
I'll ask you a question.